What if you knew that the evolution of the human species is accelerating right now, and that you have a vital role to play? And what if you learned how to create a big, bright, beautiful, sexy, abundant life and heal the world, all in the same motion? This is The Evolutionary, accelerating personal evolution and inciting global transformation to propel us into the age of miracles. Hello and welcome to The Evolutionary. My name is David Knox and I am still your host. So first things first, guys. I was having some trouble with my teeth. Yeah, my teeth. They were hurting a lot, which is weird. So I did some research and long story short, I ended up opting for some orthodontia. So I have some extra stuff in my mouth and I may sound a little different for a while, so bear with me. Anyway, thank you for plugging me in today and I welcome you to Solocast 4. Today is going to be fun because I'm going to start to delineate and describe for you the 6 factors that make this a very special time in human history. A time when the intentional evolution and the consciousness expansion of a very few people can have a remarkable, astounding, up-leveling impact on the evolution and consciousness of the collective. In fact, this is happening right now. And as if this whole scenario was straight out of Hollywood, this potential to incite rapid evolution is coming to light at exactly the right time to heal our society, our systems, and our planet, and save us from destroying ourselves, which would be great, and, by the way, propel us into the age of miracles. So while today will be filled with a lot of good stuff, I want to give you the main premise right now, and I'll spend the rest of this episode trying to back it up. So here it is. This is what I want you to understand today. Everything is going to be all right. Everything is going to be all right. In fact, things are going to be even better than most people could ever imagine. And I don't say this lightly. I have a pretty firm grasp on the gravity of our situation here. And to illustrate that fact, I'm recording this episode in July 2020, in the middle of the COVID pandemic and the Black Lives Matter movement. And I live in Portland, Oregon, and we have some really fucked up brutality being executed against peaceful protesters by federal troops and local cops right now. And on top of all of this is 6X, the mass extinction we're causing, plus global warming, war, greed, partisan politics, etc., etc. It's like things are coming to a head after thousands of years of fear and division. Still, I maintain, everything is going to be all right for the human race. In fact, things are perfect right now to create rapid change and bring us into harmony and balance with our environment and with each other. So the point of today's podcast is to start to explore the factors that are lining up right now to allow and to guide humanity toward that evolution. I'm telling you this up front because many people in the world today, many people that I personally know and love, think that all hope is lost. Think that we're past the point of no return and that apocalypse is inevitable. And whether they think this because they watch the network news and the mainstream media that paint the picture, or whether they got sucked down into the dark documentaries that are out there that also paint that picture but offer no resolution, the result is the same. Their energy, whether they intended or not, got hijacked and it's feeding that apocalyptic vibe. So I want to help people change their energy and thereby help to get our world turned around while at the same time creating a better life for themselves. You may have picked up from previous episodes that this is exactly what The Evolutionary is about. And a big part of that is giving intelligent people a rational basis for hope for humanity. And in fact, we can go beyond hope to action and to expectation and to execution. Because actually all of these factors have aligned in our favor and many more, and we have help. More on that later in the season. But before we get into all of that, let's do a very brief recap of our first 2 solocasts, so we can have context and continuity for today's discussion. For Solo 3, we'll hold off the recap until our next solocast because it's more relevant to that discussion. So this whole thing started with Solo 1, where we talked about basically 2 things. One is the universal human quandary, and the second one was the secret to the secret. And the universal quandary is that we are, all of us, working and visualizing and praying and meditating to create that big, bright, beautiful, sexy, abundant life that we desire. And yet it doesn't take a super genius to figure out that our perfect life won't mean won't mean crap, if we don't have a planet to live on. Or if the greater context for our lives, i.e. society, is in complete chaos. So we're compelled by the insanity of our current human condition to do something about that also, while trying to create the life we desire. But who has time for both? This is the universal human quandary. Simultaneously, most of us have been utilizing some version or semblance of the law of attraction to create the life that we desire, but it's hit and miss. It's hit and miss for everyone. It seems there's a secret to the secret. There's a missing variable that, if we knew what it was, we could manifest our desires much more quickly and reliably. And by observing the fact that we are each a holographic fractal representation of the universe, and that the universe is observably evolutionary, we can see that the universe's top priority for us, above our happiness, health, wealth, sometimes even our personal safety, is for us to evolve. This is what I call the primacy of the evolutionary imperative, and it is the secret to the secret. And the first thing this incites us to do is to focus our manifestation requests on what we want to become versus what we want to get. The material circumstances we desire will flow naturally to us as a consequence of our becoming the person who would naturally attract and sustain them. And then the bonus is that by evolving ourselves at this special time in history, we can have a tremendous impact on the evolution of the species and help humanity to rise above the current historical condition and into harmony with the planet and with each other. Those are the high points of Solo 1. So in Solo 2, we talked about the 3 foundational elements or prerequisites for evolutionary manifestation. Number 1, we recognized that the worldview we were all raised into is completely fucked up, messed up, in that it's incredibly limiting and wildly inaccurate. But also, we recognize that it's changeable. So we endeavor to expand our worldview into something that serves us better, and serves our species better, and serves our planet better. Number 2, we talked about the doctrine of personal responsibility, which is that we all take responsibility for every aspect of our life, especially the stuff that doesn't seem like it should be our responsibility. Because this is the only path to true personal power. Any variance from this leads inevitably to powerlessness and victimhood. Number 3, we talked about the fact that we all utilize some version or semblance of the law of attraction as our primary mode of creating our lives, meaning that we use our thoughts and our feelings to connect to the energy of the life circumstances we desire as a way of attracting them to us. Okay, so together these 3 elements are the starting point or the prerequisites for learning intentional, holistic, evolutionary manifestation. And again, we'll get into how to do all of that later in the season when we get into the evolutionary dynamic. And those are the high points of Solocast 2. Okay, with all that in the background, let's get into the factors that make this a very special time in human history. One where very few people or even an individual can have unprecedented positive influence on the evolution and consciousness expansion of the collective. So I talked about in Solo 1 and multiple times since that there are various factors that have all come together synergistically to create the aforementioned circumstance. So today we're going to line out the first 3 of them. There's 6. And then at least start thinking about the ways in which they're working together to create this special time in history. And of course, we'll go over 4, 5, and 6 in the next Solocast. That will be Solo 5. Okay, factor number 1 I call the edge of an epoch. And it's derived from Ralph Abraham's model that he called the edge of the millennium. Ralph is a mathematician and chaos theorist and was good friends with Rupert Sheldrake and the late great Terence McKenna. Anyway, Ralph called this idea the edge of the millennium because he was writing about it and talking about it in the late 90s, so it had a nice topical ring to it. But to him, the word millennium didn't have as much to do with the date on the calendar as it did with the defining of an epoch or an era. And he makes this argument both logically and mathematically that you can look at history as a series of plateaus or epochs. And of course, the smaller epochs would be embedded in the larger ones ad infinitum. For instance, we can think of the entirety of human history as a larger epoch or plateau, and within it we could think of recorded human history, say the last 6,000 years or so, as another epoch within that, and then we could think of like the rise and the fall of the Roman Empire as another epoch within that. And his premise is that at the edge or near the end of an epoch, that the potential impact of our personal actions increases exponentially. Now, I didn't get into the math in my research on Ralph's idea because I didn't want to take the time to get my PhD in mathematics before recording this podcast. But if you think about this logically for like a minute, it totally holds water. Near the end of any period, when things are totally ripe for change, when systems are destabilized, that's the time when personal actions can have the most impact toward change. Let's look at an example. Let's say you did some really big evolutionary work and you became some sort of mystic, walking around healing people, changing water into wine, talking about freedom and how everyone can have a direct relationship with the divine. But let's also say you were doing this in Europe in the middle of the Dark Ages. Well, you wouldn't likely have much impact on the direction of humanity deep in the middle of that particular epoch. In fact, unless you were extremely savvy and minded your politic, you'd likely be deemed a heretic and burned at the stake, especially if you were a woman. The time wasn't right. Things were too dark and stagnant. However, if you had all of that going for you today, your possible impact would be much, much greater. Society is ready for change. People who care are listening. And most of us understand that our systems are unsustainable and that if we don't change them, we cannot survive as a species. So the stage is set for change. And from that perspective alone, a relatively small number of people can truly change the world. Okay, factor number 2 is called energy in the system. And it has to do with the nature of our collective consciousness and the mechanism for its up-leveling. And while consciousness is only one of many aspects of human beings that needs to evolve for us to move to the next level, it's the most vital. In fact, I'd say that all other aspects of our evolution feed into this one key measure or support it in some way. In other words, the intention behind all of our evolutionary developments is the expansion of our consciousness. Because it's the expansion of our consciousness that will secure our survival as a species, bring us into harmony with each other and with our environment, and ultimately allow our civilization to be birthed into the stars. And who knows, maybe we even move past the need for a physical body at some point in the very distant future. Okay, cool, but how is the collective consciousness of our species determined? What does it comprise? How do each of us impact it? Well, the tendency is for most people to think that it's a democracy, in that we all have exactly the same impact, one person, one vote. Of course, that would mean that if we have 7.8 billion people on the planet, that we need somewhere north of 3.9 billion people to evolve or expand their consciousness to a certain degree in order to move the needle on the collective. The issue that we run into immediately in the democracy model is that consciousness is not a simple assessment. It's not slow to change and relatively stable like a thermometer reading. Consciousness is a very complex notion with potentially countless aspects to it. First of all, in my definition, the concept of consciousness has 3 components. Awareness, which is where a lot of people stop. They say just consciousness equals awareness and that's it. But I think it's important to add in understanding. Because if you're aware of something but you don't understand it, that's not very helpful. But then we need a final component, and let's call that actualization. And by actualization, I mean taking our awareness and our understanding of that awareness and then putting them into action in our lives. Or rather, a better way of saying it would probably be integrating them into our way of being. So that, by the way, is how we'll define consciousness in this series. It's the combination of awareness plus understanding and then actualization, which is integrating all of that into our way of being. But then it goes deeper. The great Ken Wilber, creator of integral theory, teaches 12 lines of consciousness development in his program, but has suggested that there could be a lot more. And here's the thing. They can all be at very different stages in the same person at the same time. For example, someone can be highly developed in their cognitive consciousness, but not their ethical or moral consciousness, like the CEO of a company that's destroying the earth, for example. Or one can be highly developed in their spiritual consciousness, but underdeveloped in their emotional consciousness. For example, you ever know someone who's intensely frustrated with their partner because he or she is exhibiting high-minded spirituality, but completely bypassing the true emotional nature of the relationship? By the way, this is a trap we fall into sometimes, especially us men, when implementing the spiritual concept of detachment. We like it because we can use it to think our way around having to deal with feelings. But I digress. So there's lots of aspects to consciousness, and in the human experience, they're all fluctuating all of the time. I mean, I can go from a deep meditation where I'm filled with gratitude for every aspect of my life to like an hour later being angry with someone in traffic because they don't drive like I do. So when we think about human consciousness, it's important to understand that it's in a constant state of flux and it's anything but simple. Okay, with that in the background, let's revisit the question. How does the consciousness of individuals coalesce into the consciousness of the collective? What's the accounting like? Is it a true democracy where each person has the same impact? Again, if that were true, we would need something north of 3.9 billion people to up-level their average aggregate consciousness in some meaningful way in order to move the needle on the collective. Well, this is the other problem with the democracy model. That just doesn't seem doable, especially on our critical timeline. And fortunately, that doesn't seem to be how it works. Because if we glance back at history, significant advancements in our societies did not wait for the majority of the population to be on board. Think about the Renaissance in Europe or the abolition of slavery worldwide. I've heard estimates that it only took about 10% of the population waking up to tip the scales and make those things happen, suggesting that we don't need a majority, we just need enough people, and probably the right people, to wake up to a better way of being. Okay, well that sounds more like a shareholder vote to me, where the number of votes you get is equal to the number of shares you own, which simply in this case means that some people have more impact than others. And this is sort of what it's like. Your expanded consciousness can offset the diminutive consciousness of many other people. How many? Well, it depends on what you're bringing to the game, but I would say that there is no upper limit. Which is why the model I like best for thinking about the collective consciousness is that it's about energy in the system. Let's consider the metaphor of a really big light bulb. And this light bulb has some really special wiring. It has 7.8 billion wires feeding into it, one for each human on Earth, so 7.8 billion and counting. And all of these wires have zero resistance in them, so each can handle an infinite amount of energy going through them. And the brightness of the light, which of course in this metaphor represents the collective consciousness of humanity, is based on the energy flowing into that system from those 7.8 billion feeds. And here's the thing. It doesn't matter if the energy is coming from one person or 1 million people or 7.8 billion people. If enough energy is being fed into that system, then the light shines brighter. And we'll discuss a possible mechanism for this in the next episode. So our job is to expand our consciousness, which again is the combination of awareness, understanding, and actualization, as much as possible in this life. And here's another thing. There are a lot of people bringing a lot of energy into our system right now. It's phenomenal to be alive today and see so many loving, brilliant, creative, inventive, compassionate beings on this earth, all at the same time. And there are people waking up in all levels of every kind of organization. In fact, in my opinion, we've already hit the tipping point, where humanity has started the process of healing and rapid evolution. And the best evidence for this, aside from the aforementioned outbreak of rad people bringing big expansive consciousness to the game, is the fact that shit is so dark right now. I know that sounds a little oxymoronic, but it has to do with what we talked about in factor number 1. Systems are being weakened by the waves of expanding consciousness that are crashing into them. And those who are clinging to the darkness and are afraid of change are making a really big stink. And in my opinion, this is clear evidence that it's working. That things are shifting big time. Remember that old adage, it's darkest before dawn? This applies to right now, as old forces grasp to keep control even as we slip closer and closer and closer to the new Renaissance. And this will propel us into the age of miracles. I know that sounds fluffy, but listen, that's what's happening. That's where we're at right now. And it's a damn good thing. I mean, can anyone really imagine the human race trying to limp along in our current status quo for another 100 years, or even another 50 years, or even another 20 years? It's not even ecologically possible, much less morally possible. So things are changing, and it's going to be a little bit bumpy, so hold on. And do everything in your power to remain positive and focused on the life you want, but it's also vital to stay focused on your vision for the world that you want to live in as the context for that life you're creating. And just a note about that, I mentioned that we're past the tipping point already. So does that mean that you and I can just sit back and sip a pina colada and watch the awakening and the healing of our planet without doing our own evolutionary work? Well, here's the thing. The thing that's at stake is the rate at which it happens. We need to accelerate the awakening for two very good reasons. One is that it's unclear if we have enough time to turn this ship around before massive ecological meltdown wipes us all out. That sounds bleak, but that's where we are. So we need as many hands on deck as we can get here. And the other reason is just plain and simple compassion. Every day that we toil in the current status quo, untold millions of people and other species live and die in violence and suffering. So the difference between waking up in 1 decade, let's say, versus waking up in 2 decades is 10 years worth of violence and suffering for countless beings. So yeah, we need as many people as possible to accelerate along their own evolutionary path, because that will accelerate this process, and because from the standpoint of compassion alone, every day counts. Okay, moving on. The third factor that makes this such a special and unique time in human history is that we are living in the information age. The flow of information on this planet today is totally unprecedented in human history that we know of, and has some totally awesome consequences. This flow is, in and of itself, serving to accelerate the evolution of the collective consciousness of the human species in multiple ways. And the first way has to do with the idea that enhanced inspection shortens the learning curve. I'll say that again. Enhanced inspection shortens the learning curve. Let me expound. So I heard this cheesy quote from a guy named Ken Blanchard. Actually, I love the quote. It's, "Feedback is the breakfast of champions." Because think about this. In Solocast 3, we talked about the process of creation that occurs at all scales. And it goes like this. We create something with intention, and during the unfoldment of that creation, we gain feedback from the results. And during this whole process, our intention itself evolves. So then we merge that feedback that we got with the evolved intention, make adjustments on the next round of creation, and that's how it goes. This is the process of creation happening at all scales in the universe. Well, one variable that can speed up that process significantly is the availability of feedback information. So when you think about our society, the information flow and communications capabilities that are available to us today have accelerated the rate and volume of that feedback information exponentially from just a few decades ago. Therefore, we're getting to examine the results of our own behavior as a species almost in real time, versus having to wait for future generations to gain perspective through some sort of historical reflection. So in the information age, all of the good behavior and all of the bad behavior, just about, is just out there on the table for everyone to see. So we can be a lot faster to recoil from the bad behavior and make some sort of adjustments. But of course, one topic that always comes up in this discussion is the concern over misinformation. And this is where developing our powers of discernment come in, which is a very important topic, but it's a topic for another day. So another way the information age is accelerating our evolution is through a phenomenon I call the emergence of the layman expert. The ubiquity of information we enjoy today enables people who are bored, possibly a bit introverted, and have access to the internet to become highly educated fairly quickly in whatever field interests them. So from this scenario, we're witnessing the rise of a lot of experts who are, for the most part, not constrained by affiliation or dependency upon any academic, governmental, or corporate institutions. Right? So if you're bored or driven and have a deep interest in something like archaeology, for instance, you don't have to be accepted to a college or find the money to pay for it. You have access to enough information via the internet to become an expert in that area. And the bonus is that you'll get to think for yourself instead of having to pledge allegiance to some ridiculous outdated ideas, like the pyramids were built by farmers in the off-season with copper tools and vine ropes, for instance. In anthropology and archaeology, people like Graham Hancock, John Anthony West, Michael Cremo, Lloyd Pye, Michael Tellinger, Freddie Silva, and countless others have done just that. Before the information age, these free-thinking pioneers would not have been able to study their field so deeply. And even if they found a way to do so, their ideas would have been totally squashed and ignored. In fact, the establishment has tried to squash them. But in the information age, they can find an audience. And in doing so, they're forcing the acceleration of scientific thinking in those fields. I mean, think of how many students at many levels are questioning their professors and teachers because of these guys. It puts tremendous pressure on academia to start to revise their story into something that actually starts to make sense given the evidence that's available. And this is happening in many disciplines. Nassim Haramein educated himself while living in a van and became a physicist. But much like Einstein, he has no PhD. Well, actually, I guess technically Einstein did have a PhD because they had to give him one in order to give him the Nobel Prize. Evidently, there's some rules about stuff like that. Anyway, Nassim right now is heading up work that is laying the foundation for unifying cosmological and quantum physics, publishing papers at a rapid pace, doing a lot of research, and describing the source of things that have been a mystery for all of human history, like the source of gravity, like the source of light. And people like this are coming out of the woodwork, and their ideas are gaining popularity. And because of this, we're moments away from creating things like gravitational devices, free, clean, limitless energy sources, and communications that can transmit across the cosmos in a nanosecond. And because of the aforementioned pioneers in anthropology and archaeology, we're opening up to a past that is more fantastic and galactic and colorful and high-tech than we've ever considered before. And also because of the information age, you can listen to this podcast whenever you want. Share it with your friends. You can even reach out to the host if you're so inclined. Anyway, we have 3 more factors to cover, but I've been talking for a while, so I'm going to save those for the next Solocast. But just to give you a preview, the titles of those sections are as follows. Number 4 is Morphic Resonance. Number 5 is called Nature Abhors Devolution. And number 6 is called Magic. And I can't wait for those discussions, so join me in Solo 5 and we'll have a good time sorting it all out. Thank you so much for listening today. Take care of yourself and your loved ones, and remember, hold the vision you want for the world as the context for the life you're working to create. If you'd like to learn more about The Evolutionary, you can check us out at theevolutionary.life. That's right, .life.com is so last season. It's theevolutionary.life. Check it out. Thank you so much for listening. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button, and I'll talk to you next time.